I will be speaking on the Third Amendment, and particularly the part of that Third Amendment that addresses the extraordinary economic hurt in much of rural America. Senator Baucus and the ranking minority member, Senator Grassley, have worked very closely with me and a number of members of the Senate who represent rural communities where the federal government owns much of the land. And tonight, it looks like there is some promising news ahead for these desperately hard-hit rural communities. Mr. President and colleagues, more than 100 years ago, our rural communities entered into an agreement with the federal government. And what these rural communities said was that, in effect, they would give up their land so there could be a national forest system, and in return, the federal government would ensure that these rural communities would have sufficient funds for schools and basic services. And this was facilitated by tying these payments to the rural communities to the amount of timber that was cut in these areas. This went quite well for many years. But as the environmental laws in our country began to change, this money shriveled up. It shriveled up, and we were faced with the prospect in rural communities of having school 3 days a week. In my part of the country, our law enforcement officials wouldn't have the funds that they desperately need to fight this epidemic of methamphetamines. And suffice it to say, there was a real question, Mr. President, and there continues to be, as to whether some of these communities and some of these rural counties would actually survive. We've got 3 in our state that are walking on an economic tightrope right now. And what Chairman Baucus and Senator Grassley have done, working with a host of us from these communities, myself, Senator Feinstein, Senator Cantwell, Senator Murray, Senator Smith, Crapo, Craig, colleagues on both sides of the aisle, is they've given us the opportunity, if this third part of the extenders package passes tonight, to give new hope to these rural areas. And the hope comes in the form of a multi-year reauthorization of the law that I wrote in 2000 with Senator Craig, the Secure Rural Schools legislation. It provides a safety net for these communities so they can educate their kids in our part of the country, fight drugs and crime, and pay for essential services. Right now, pink slips have been sent out in my state and elsewhere to county workers, teachers, and others. And without the legislation that has been put together so carefully by Chairman Baucus and Senator Grassley, my view is that we will see devastating losses to the very fabric of rural communities. And, Mr. President, some of those rural communities will not survive. Today's vote, the vote that we are going to have this afternoon, provides the best opportunity we have seen in many, many months to ensure that rural communities do not drown in economic crisis. And, Mr. President, the reason that this proposal is so very important is it is a multi-year reauthorization of the law that Senator Craig and I wrote in 2000. And the reason we feel so strongly about a multi-year reauthorization is that will give our rural communities an opportunity to plan for new economic development efforts where they can create good-paying jobs for their people.